He thought a foreign language would make her feel invisible. What he didn't know was that every word he spoke was leading him toward the most embarrassing moment of his life. The private dining room on the 42nd floor overlooked the glittering skyline of Manhattan, where thousands of lights shimmered against the darkness like scattered diamonds. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow across the polished oak table, illuminating faces that belonged to people who were used to being listened to the moment they entered any room. At the center of it all sat Ethan Park, a man whose presence carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years building influence, wealth, and a reputation that opened doors before he ever touched the handle. His charcoal suit fit perfectly. His silver watch reflected the chandelier light every time he moved his wrist. Around him sat international investors, business executives, and longtime associates, all laughing politely at his stories and nodding a little too eagerly whenever he spoke. Meanwhile, Naomi Carter stood near the wall holding a silver serving tray. To most people in the room, she was part of the furniture. She moved silently between conversations, refilling glasses, replacing plates, and making sure every detail remained flawless. Nobody asked her opinion. Nobody wondered what she thought. Nobody even looked at her for more than a second. She had worked inside Ethan's penthouse for nearly 8 months, and in all that time, most of his guests never learned her name. They knew her only as the maid. The woman who appeared when something needed cleaning and disappeared when the work was done. Ethan glanced toward her as she poured sparkling water into a guest's glass. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then he switched languages. The conversation instantly shifted into Korean. Several guests smiled knowingly and followed his lead. One executive chuckled as Ethan nodded toward Naomi. Another leaned forward with interest. Their voices lowered slightly, but not enough. They wanted privacy, but they also wanted an audience. Ethan said something that caused the table to erupt with laughter. One man nearly spilled his drink. Another covered his mouth as he grinned. Across the room, Naomi continued working without reacting. Ethan watched her carefully. That was the point. He wanted to see if she noticed. He wanted to enjoy the certainty that she couldn't possibly understand. In his mind, this was harmless entertainment, a joke shared among insiders. The privilege of speaking freely in a language nobody else in the room knew. He made another comment. More laughter followed. One guest added his own observation, glancing openly at Naomi before shaking his head with amusement. The atmosphere grew lighter, more relaxed, more careless. The conversation drifted beyond jokes and into matters they assumed were completely private. Business matters. Sensitive matters. The kind of information powerful people preferred to discuss behind closed doors. Still, Naomi showed no reaction. She calmly collected empty glasses. She straightened silverware. She lowered her eyes and continued working exactly as expected. That should have reassured Ethan. Instead, something about her composure began to bother him. Most people reacted somehow when they felt excluded, embarrassed, uncomfortable, curious. Naomi gave nothing away. It was as though she existed inside a different reality entirely. Ethan leaned back in his chair and studied her more closely. Around him, the conversation continued. More Korean, more laughter, more assumptions. Nobody noticed the tiny pause that crossed Naomi's face as she reached for an empty glass. Nobody noticed the almost imperceptible tightening of her fingers around the tray. And nobody in that room realized that the woman they believed couldn't understand a single word had been listening to every sentence from the very beginning. Naomi Carter had learned long ago that the easiest way to survive inside rooms full of powerful people was to let them underestimate her. It was a lesson she had carried through every chapter of her life, through every disappointment, every sacrifice, and every door that had quietly closed in her face. As the dinner continued around her, she moved through the room with practiced precision, collecting plates and refreshing glasses while conversations flowed around her like background music. To Ethan's guests, she was invisible. To Naomi, that invisibility had become a shield. Nobody questioned a person they considered unimportant. Nobody guarded their words around someone they assumed could not possibly understand them. The irony would have been amusing if it had not been so familiar. Nearly every guest in the room had formed an opinion about her within seconds of seeing her. A black maid carrying a serving tray. A quiet woman who rarely spoke. In their minds, her entire story ended there. They never wondered why her posture remained so composed. They never noticed the calm confidence hidden beneath her silence. They never asked themselves why someone who seemed so ordinary carried herself with such steady control. Across the room, Ethan continued entertaining his guests. The laughter came easily. His reputation alone seemed to make people eager to impress him. Yet every few minutes his eyes drifted back toward Naomi. Something about her lack of reaction continued bothering him. Most people revealed themselves under pressure. Most people showed discomfort when they became the subject of a joke. Naomi showed nothing. It was almost as though she had heard far worse before. The truth was that she had. Years earlier, before life had taken unexpected turns, Naomi had spent her days surrounded by textbooks instead of serving trays. While her classmates spent weekends relaxing, she had spent countless hours studying languages, culture, and international communication. She had fallen in love with the idea that language could connect people who otherwise had nothing in common. Korean had been one of her favorites, not because it was easy, but because it challenged her. Every new phrase felt like solving a puzzle. Every conversation opened another window into a different world. But life rarely follows the plans people make at 20 years old. Family emergencies arrived without warning. Medical bills accumulated. Priorities changed. Dreams were placed on hold, one practical decision at a time. Eventually, the career she had imagined disappeared beneath responsibilities she could not ignore. What remained was resilience, the ability to adapt, the determination to keep moving forward no matter how different the destination looked from the map she once carried. A burst of laughter pulled her attention back to the present. One of Ethan's guests had made another comment in Korean. Several people around the table smiled knowingly. Another man added something that caused even louder laughter. Naomi placed a fresh glass beside a guest without lifting her eyes. Outwardly, she appeared unaffected. Inwardly, she remembered every word. Not because she wanted to, because she could not help it. Language had always stayed with her. Every phrase landed with perfect clarity. Every assumption revealed itself. Every careless judgment exposed more about the speakers than the person they believed they were mocking. The city lights shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the evening continued. Beyond the glass, Manhattan stretched for miles beneath the night sky. Inside the dining room, however, a different kind of distance existed. It separated those who believed they knew everything from the woman they had never truly seen. And with every passing minute, that distance was bringing the room closer to a moment none of them were prepared for. The dinner moved into its second hour, and the atmosphere inside the penthouse grew increasingly relaxed. Expensive wine had softened formal boundaries. Jackets were draped over chair backs. Ties had loosened. What began as a carefully managed business dinner was slowly becoming something more revealing. People always exposed themselves when they became comfortable enough to believe nobody was watching. Or in this case, when they believed nobody was understanding. Naomi carried a fresh tray of coffee cups from the kitchen and stepped quietly into the dining room. The scent of roasted coffee beans mixed with polished wood and candle wax. She moved carefully between the guests, setting each cup in place without interrupting the conversation. The moment she stepped away, Korean words filled the room again. Ethan's guests seemed almost relieved to return to a language they assumed belonged exclusively to them. One executive leaned forward and lowered his voice. Another glanced briefly toward Naomi before smirking. Ethan followed his gaze. A few comments were exchanged. Several people laughed. Then the conversation drifted somewhere unexpected. The joking stopped. Business replaced entertainment. Numbers were mentioned. Deadlines. International agreements. Potential partnerships stretching across multiple countries. The tone became more serious, more confidential. Naomi continued clearing plates while every word reached her with crystal clarity. She wished it did not. She wished she could tune it out. But language had never worked that way for her. Once she understood something, she could not choose not to understand it. Across the table, one guest expressed concerns about an upcoming international contract. Another dismissed those concerns immediately. Ethan listened carefully, occasionally adding his opinion. The discussion grew increasingly detailed. Dates were compared. Financial projections were debated. Then one of the executives made a statement that caused a small knot to form in Naomi's stomach. She paused for half a second before continuing toward the kitchen. The statement itself sounded harmless, but the wording was not. A key phrase had been misunderstood, not by the people speaking Korean, but by the translation team handling documents overseas. Naomi recognized the issue instantly because she had encountered similar language years earlier during advanced translation studies. Certain expressions carried entirely different meanings depending on context. One small misunderstanding could change the interpretation of an entire agreement. She told herself it was not her problem. She was there to serve dinner, nothing more. Yet as the conversation continued, the concern refused to leave her mind. Back at the table, Ethan appeared completely at ease. He trusted the people around him. They were experienced professionals, industry experts, people with impressive resumes and impressive titles. Why would he listen to a maid over them? The thought almost made Naomi smile. The answer was simple. He would not, which was exactly why she remained silent. Another round of laughter erupted. One guest made a remark about employees who should focus on carrying trays instead of understanding business. Several people nodded in agreement. Ethan did not stop them. He merely sipped his coffee and watched the city lights beyond the windows. The comment lingered in the air longer than the others. Naomi heard it. She heard all of it. Yet her expression never changed. That calm composure only encouraged them further. They mistook silence for ignorance. They mistook humility for limitation. They mistook kindness for weakness. And with every passing minute, their confidence grew. What nobody realized was that the conversation they believed demonstrated their intelligence was slowly revealing something entirely different. It was revealing assumptions, blind spots, arrogance, the very things that often create the biggest mistakes. Naomi reached the doorway leading toward the kitchen and paused briefly as another critical detail surfaced in the discussion. This time the issue was even more serious. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray. For the first time that evening, she considered speaking. Then she remembered where she was. She remembered who was sitting at that table. And she continued walking, unaware that the decision to remain silent was becoming harder with every sentence she heard. Naomi set the tray down beside the coffee station and stared at the reflection of the city in the dark glass. For several seconds she considered doing what she had done countless times before. Say nothing. Finish your shift. Go home. Let highly paid professionals deal with problems that belong to them. It would have been the easier choice, the safer choice. Yet the conversation continued drifting from the dining room, and every new sentence made the mistake more obvious. By the time she returned carrying a fresh pot of coffee, the discussion had reached the very clause that concerned her most. Ethan was listening while one of the executives confidently explained the interpretation of a Korean expression that would affect a major international agreement. The man spoke with certainty. The others nodded. Nobody questioned him. Nobody except the woman standing quietly beside the table. Naomi began refilling cups one by one. The executive continued speaking. Then he repeated the phrase again. This time Naomi stopped moving. The room remained focused on the discussion. Nobody noticed her at first. She looked at Ethan. He was reviewing figures on a tablet while listening to the explanation. Another executive praised the translation team. A third remarked that the agreement was practically finalized. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. She knew exactly what would happen if nobody corrected the misunderstanding. The phrase did not mean what they thought it meant. Not in that context. Not in that regional dialect. The difference seemed small. The consequences would not be. For a moment, she almost walked away. Then the executive repeated the phrase a third time. Naomi took a slow breath. Excuse me. The words were soft, but they immediately changed the atmosphere. Conversation stopped. Several guests turned toward her with visible surprise. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes from the tablet. Silence settled over the table. Naomi rarely spoke during these dinners. One guest looked irritated by the interruption. Another appeared amused. Ethan watched her carefully. Yes, he asked. Naomi hesitated. Every instinct warned her to remain silent. Yet she had already crossed the line. The phrase you are discussing, she said calmly, does not mean what you think it means. The room froze. For a second nobody reacted. Then one executive laughed. Another exchanged a glance with his colleague. Ethan leaned back in his chair. And how would you know that? He asked. Naomi met his gaze. Then, without warning, she answered in flawless Korean. Not only Korean, but a regional Busan dialect so natural that several guests visibly straightened in their chairs. The laughter vanished instantly. Naomi continued speaking. Her pronunciation was precise. Her rhythm effortless. She explained the phrase exactly as a native speaker might. Then she pointed out a grammatical nuance that completely changed the meaning of the clause being discussed. One executive blinked in confusion. Another stared openly. Ethan did not move at all. Naomi calmly finished her explanation in Korean before switching back to English. The interpretation being used here is incorrect, she said. If the contract follows that translation, the obligations will not be what you expect. No one spoke. The chandelier light reflected across crystal glasses while the silence stretched longer and longer. The guests who had spent the evening assuming she understood nothing now looked as though they were seeing her for the first time. Ethan's expression remained unreadable, but something had changed behind his eyes. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier had been replaced by uncertainty. And for the first time that evening, the person everyone thought was least qualified to speak had become the only voice anyone wanted to hear. No one reached for a coffee cup. No one checked a phone. The entire table remained suspended in a silence that felt almost physical. Ethan Park sat motionless, studying Naomi with an intensity that had nothing to do with amusement anymore. Only minutes earlier, he had been certain he understood exactly who she was. Now that certainty was gone, one of the executives finally cleared his throat. "You speak Korean?" he asked. Naomi nodded politely. "Yes." The answer was simple, but it only deepened the confusion around the table. Another guest leaned forward. "How long did you live in Korea?" Naomi shook her head. "I have never lived there." More silence followed. The response seemed impossible to them. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. He was not a man who enjoyed unanswered questions. "Then where did you learn?" he asked. Naomi hesitated. She did not enjoy being the center of attention. "I studied languages," she replied. "A long time ago." One executive laughed nervously, still trying to recover from the embarrassment of being corrected. "Studied languages?" he repeated. "How many?" Naomi looked down at the tray in her hands. "A few." The answer only frustrated them further. Ethan noticed it immediately. For the first time all evening, the balance of the room had shifted. The people who had been speaking with complete confidence were now searching for footing. Meanwhile, the woman they had dismissed seemed perfectly comfortable standing in uncertainty. One guest decided to test her. He switched abruptly into Japanese and asked a question. Naomi answered without hesitation. Another executive tried Mandarin. Her response came just as naturally. A third attempted French. Once again she replied with effortless fluency. Each answer landed like another stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread through the room. Expressions changed. Smiles faded. Assumptions collapsed one after another. Ethan remained silent through all of it. He watched every detail. The calm way Naomi spoke. The absence of arrogance in her voice. The fact that she never tried to embarrass anyone in return. Most people in her position would have enjoyed the moment. Most people would have used it as an opportunity to settle scores. Naomi simply answered the questions and returned to quiet professionalism. Somehow that impressed him more than the languages themselves. Finally, one of the investors shook his head in disbelief. "What are you doing working as a maid?" The question escaped before anyone could stop it. Naomi offered a small smile. "Working," she said softly. A few guests looked away, suddenly aware of how insulting the question sounded. Ethan found himself unable to stop thinking about it. What was she doing here? Why was someone with her abilities carrying trays at private dinners? The answer clearly involved a story nobody in the room knew. And for reasons he could not fully explain, he suddenly wanted to know it. More than that, he wanted to know how many other things he had completely misjudged. The city lights continued glittering beyond the windows while the conversation slowly resumed, but the atmosphere had changed forever. The jokes had disappeared. The casual arrogance was gone. In its place sat curiosity. And as Ethan listened to the discussion continue, he realized something uncomfortable. The person he had paid the least attention to all year had just become the most interesting person in the room. The dinner finally came to an end shortly before midnight, but Ethan Park found himself thinking about only one thing as the last guest stepped into the private elevator. Naomi Carter. Not the contracts discussed that evening. Not the investment opportunities waiting for his approval. Not even the embarrassing realization that an entire table of accomplished executives had been corrected by the one person they had dismissed. Naomi quietly gathered empty glasses while the room slowly returned to silence. She worked exactly as she always had. Calm, efficient, unassuming. Yet now every movement seemed different to Ethan. It was not that she had changed. It was that his understanding of her had changed. As she carried a tray toward the kitchen, he watched her disappear through the doorway. Then he looked around the empty dining room and felt an unfamiliar sense of frustration. How had he missed something so obvious? The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office earlier than usual. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked lower Manhattan as sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers. A stack of reports sat untouched on his desk. Instead, he pressed a button on the intercom. "David, come in." Less than a minute later, his chief operations manager entered carrying a tablet. David Reynolds had worked beside Ethan for nearly 10 years and knew him well enough to recognize when something unusual was happening. "You wanted to see me?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about Naomi Carter." David blinked. "The housemaid." Ethan nodded. "Everything." For several seconds, David simply stared. Of all the questions he expected that morning, that one had not been on the list. "There is not much to tell," he said carefully. "She has worked for us about 8 months. Excellent employee. Never late. Never complains. Staff likes her. No disciplinary issues." Ethan frowned. "That is not everything." David hesitated. "No, it is not." He opened the tablet and scrolled through personnel records. She graduated with honors from a university language program. Ethan straightened slightly. "Go on." According to her file, she specialized in international communications and advanced translation studies. Multiple academic awards. Several overseas exchange programs. Professors described her as exceptional. Ethan stared at him. "And she is working as a maid." David nodded. "Her mother became seriously ill several years ago. Medical expenses accumulated quickly. She left graduate school and entered the workforce. Most of her income went towards supporting family responsibilities." Silence settled across the office. Ethan walked toward the windows overlooking the city. Thousands of people moved through the streets below, each carrying a story invisible to everyone around them. Suddenly, Naomi's quiet composure made sense. The discipline, the humility, the complete absence of self-pity. She had sacrificed opportunities most people spent their lives chasing. Yet she never mentioned it. Never demanded recognition. Never tried to impress anyone. David glanced at him. "There is something else." Ethan turned. "What?" One of her professors described her as one of the most gifted language students he had encountered in 20 years. Ethan slowly exhaled. The words lingered in the room long after David finished speaking. For the second time in less than 24 hours, Ethan realized how wrong he had been. But what troubled him most was not that he had underestimated Naomi. It was the uncomfortable realization that he had never truly looked at her at all. 3 days later, the issue everyone thought had been resolved returned with far greater consequences. The conference room on the 38th floor was filled with attorneys, consultants, financial analysts, and representatives from one of South Korea's largest investment groups. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls while dozens of pages of contracts lay spread across the polished table. Ethan sat at the head of the room, reviewing final figures. Months of negotiations had led to this meeting. If everything went according to plan, the agreement would open opportunities worth tens of millions of dollars over the next decade. Yet despite the importance of the day, a subtle tension hung over the room. The lead translator assigned to the project appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Several times he asked for clarification. Several times he reviewed the same section again. Nobody paid much attention at first. Complex agreements often required careful review. But as the morning progressed, delays began accumulating. Questions repeated themselves. Discussions circled back to points that should have been settled already. Ethan noticed the pattern immediately. So did the Korean delegation. By noon, frustration had started creeping into conversations. During a short break, Ethan stepped into the hallway to answer a call. As he passed the executive lounge, he noticed Naomi arranging refreshments for the afternoon session. She had been assigned temporary support duties for the event because of her familiarity with international guests. The moment he saw her, an idea surfaced. It seemed ridiculous. Yet after everything he had learned, it no longer felt impossible. Before he could say anything, one of the attorneys rushed from the conference room carrying a stack of papers. His expression was pale. "We have a problem," he said. Within minutes, everyone returned to the table. A disputed section had emerged inside the final contract. The language appeared straightforward in English, but carried a different implication in Korean. The translator insisted the wording was acceptable. The Korean delegation disagreed. Voices remained professional, but concern spread rapidly through the room. If the disagreement could not be resolved, months of work might collapse. Ethan listened carefully as both sides presented their arguments. Then he noticed something. Naomi had paused near the doorway. Her eyes moved across the disputed page. Only for a moment, but he recognized the same expression he had seen during the dinner. The expression of someone spotting a mistake. Ethan felt a strange certainty settle over him. "Naomi," he said. Every head turned. The room fell silent. Naomi looked surprised. "Sir." Ethan slid the contract across the table. "Take a look." Several executives exchanged confused glances. One attorney actually looked offended. Yet Ethan ignored them. Naomi approached cautiously and reviewed the page. Less than 30 seconds passed. Then she looked up. "The issue is not the sentence," she said quietly. "It is the cultural interpretation attached to the sentence." Silence followed. She continued, calmly, clearly, without a trace of arrogance. She explained how a specific expression carried different expectations depending on business context and regional usage. Then she proposed alternative wording that preserved the agreement's intent in both languages. The Korean representatives immediately began nodding. One of them smiled for the first time all day. Another leaned forward and said something in Korean. Naomi answered fluently. Within minutes, the tension that had threatened the entire negotiation disappeared. People began reviewing the revised wording. Attorneys checked notes. Consultants compared translations. One by one, agreement spread around the table. Ethan sat quietly watching it happen. The woman everyone once assumed belonged outside the conversation had just become the reason the conversation could continue. The revised language moved through the room with remarkable speed. Attorneys who had spent hours debating suddenly found themselves in agreement. Consultants stopped arguing over interpretations and started discussing implementation. The Korean delegation reviewed the proposed wording one final time before exchanging satisfied nods. What had looked like an obstacle capable of delaying the entire partnership had disappeared because one person understood something everyone else had missed. Naomi stood quietly beside the conference table while the discussion continued around her. She had no desire to become the center of attention. In her mind, she had simply done what any responsible person should do when they saw a problem. Yet the atmosphere inside the room made it impossible to pretend nothing had changed. People who had barely acknowledged her presence earlier that morning were now directing questions toward her. A senior consultant asked for clarification on a regional expression. A legal advisor requested her opinion on a translated paragraph. Even members of the Korean delegation began speaking with her directly. Each conversation revealed the same thing. Naomi understood far more than anyone had imagined. Ethan watched it all from the head of the table. More importantly, he watched how she handled it. There was no pride in her voice. No attempt to make anyone feel foolish. No satisfaction at proving others wrong. She answered questions with patience and respect, treating every person in the room with the same courtesy. That impressed him more than any language ever could. By late afternoon, the final agreement was ready. Pens were placed on the table. Documents were reviewed one last time. The signatures that followed represented months of work and a future worth millions of dollars. Cameras captured photographs. Hands were shaken. Smiles appeared across faces that only hours earlier had been filled with concern. One of the Korean executives approached Ethan before leaving. He spoke briefly in Korean while glancing toward Naomi. Ethan listened carefully. Then the executive bowed slightly toward her and thanked her personally for helping preserve the partnership. Several others did the same. Naomi accepted each gesture politely, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Once the room finally began emptying, Ethan remained seated. The conference table that had been crowded all day now sat nearly empty beneath the afternoon sunlight. Naomi gathered abandoned folders and coffee cups. For a moment, it looked as though the day would end exactly as every other workday had ended. Then Ethan stood. "Naomi." She paused. "Yes, sir." The title suddenly felt strange to him. After everything he had learned, the distance it created seemed inaccurate. Ethan glanced at the signed contracts spread across the table. "Do you realize what happened today?" Naomi looked at the documents and then back at him. The agreement was finalized. Ethan shook his head slightly. The agreement was saved. For the first time all day, Naomi seemed unsure how to respond. Ethan studied her for a moment. The woman who had entered his life as an employee had quietly become the most valuable voice in the room when it mattered most. And as he looked around the empty conference room, he realized that everyone else had finally seen what he should have noticed from the beginning. The following Monday, Ethan Park called a meeting that surprised nearly everyone in the company. Department heads filled the executive conference room. Senior managers took their seats along the polished table. Several of the same people who had attended the dinner and the contract negotiations were present as well. They assumed the meeting would focus on the newly finalized international partnership. Instead, Ethan stood at the front of the room and looked around in silence for several moments. The city skyline stretched behind him through walls of glass, but his attention remained fixed on the people gathered before him. Then he spoke. "A few weeks ago, many of us made a mistake." Confused glances passed around the room. Ethan continued, "We judge someone based on a job title instead of character. We judge someone based on assumptions instead of facts. And some of us," he said carefully, "forgot that intelligence does not announce itself when it enters a room." The conference room became completely still. Near the back, Naomi sat quietly, uncomfortable with being included in a conversation she never wanted to make about herself. Ethan turned toward her. Naomi Carter helped save one of the most important agreements this company has signed in years. Not because she was asked to. Not because it was her responsibility. She did it because she noticed a problem and cared enough to speak up. Several executives lowered their eyes. They remembered the dinner. They remembered the jokes. They remembered the assumptions. Ethan remembered them too. "The truth is," he said, "she should never have had to prove her value in the first place." The words settled heavily across the room. No one argued. No one looked away from the truth of them. Ethan walked toward the table and placed a folder in front of Naomi. "I would like to offer you a position on our international communications team." A wave of surprise moved through the room. Naomi looked up, genuinely stunned. Ethan smiled slightly. "The salary is significantly better than your current one. The benefits are better too. And before anyone asks, no, this is not charity. You earned it." A few people laughed softly. The tension finally broke. Naomi opened the folder with trembling hands. For a moment, she simply stared at the offer. Then she looked at Ethan. "Why?" she asked quietly. Ethan considered the question. "Because talent should be recognized. Because character matters. And because I spent too much time seeing only your job instead of seeing you." The room fell silent once more. This time the silence felt different. Lighter. Honest. Naomi looked around the conference room. The same people who once overlooked her now watched her with respect. Not because she had demanded it. Not because she had fought for it. Because she had revealed who she truly was. After a long moment, she smiled. It was small, genuine, and filled with quiet dignity. "Then I accept," she said. The room erupted into applause. Ethan joined them. And as sunlight poured through the glass and reflected across the city beyond, everyone present learned the same lesson. The most valuable person in the room is not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the one standing quietly in the background, waiting for someone to look beyond the uniform. And that day, the room finally remembered what dignity looks like.